Welcome everybody to today's episode of the Great Birth Rebellion podcast, where we grapple with current research and historical knowledge to help you get the best out of your pregnancy, birth and postpartum journey. My name is Dr. Melanie Jackson at Melanie the Midwife. I'm a clinical and research midwife with my PhD, which is why I send out a weekly email which contains the resources that we use to create every single Great Birth Rebellion episode. You can join the podcast mailing list at melaniethemidwife.com. Our Great Birth Rebellion premium members also get access to podcast transcripts, additional resources, the Ask Mel a Question button, and an exclusive monthly Ask Me Anything episode where I answer listener questions. That said, let's get into it. Welcome everybody to today's episode of the Great Birth Rebellion. I'm your host, Dr. Melanie Jackson, and today I've invited two guests, both midwives who are researching at Edith Cowan University in Perth, Australia. We've got Marina Weckend and Clare Davison. And Clare also works as a private midwife, which I just think is fun because I'm also a private midwife. And the reason I've asked them on today is because the topic today is on what medical people call failure to progress. And it's horrid terminology, but that's what we're picking apart today. And Marina and Clare, along with their team of other researchers, have been working on some research which focuses on the resting phases of labour and analysing what is actually happening in labour when it has a lull or it slows down or stalls. And the terminology you're using for this is physiological plateaus. And we're going to discuss if breaks or gaps or rest periods or lulls, plateaus in labour are normal or if they point to something going wrong with labour. And in particular, we're looking at two research papers. The first was published in 2021, and that was called Physiological Plateaus During Normal Labour and Birth. And there's also a 2023 paper called Failure to Progress or Just Normal? So, welcome, Marina. Welcome, Clare. I'd love to give you each a brief moment to fully introduce yourselves.
Hi, Melanie. Hi, everyone. Well, thanks first so much for inviting us to be on the podcast. It's really exciting. Yeah, my name is Marina, a midwife by background. Have finished my training in Germany in 2010. And I worked as a midwife in various countries, in various capacities, including home birthing as well a little bit, but mostly in hospitals. And I'm currently working as a researcher affiliated with ECU, Edith Cowan University, but also with other universities. And I also work as a lecturer.
Beautiful. All right, and my name's Clare, and I am a midwife, and I mainly work in the home. As Mel said, I've been a home birth midwife for nearly 16 years in Western Australia, and I'm also an academic, and again affiliated with Edith Cowan University with this work, but I've also been working with other universities and extremely passionate about physiological birth and supporting physiology and physiological birth, which is becoming harder and harder. So this is why this topic I think is so important for us to discuss, and any research into physiology, because that's severely lacking in the research sphere.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Mel. Thank you, Mel, for inviting us.
You're welcome. People always thank me, but thank you because you guys, you're in this research. I'm so glad that you agreed to come on and share it with everybody. So I want to kick off today. Let's start talking about failure to progress. Women get accused all the time in labour of failing to progress. And so I'm just keen to know what you think of this.
Marina, I know I said you'd go first, but I'm going to jump into this because and the reason I'm going to jump into this, because I think that's a question particularly that we look at as clinicians. And obviously, and I'm sure, Mel, you'll agree with this, we often call it failure to wait. Mm-hmm. And I think that leads us into this kind of research, because what we see as home birth midwives is that sometimes labour takes longer than the cultural expected norm within the hospital system. So when women have a diagnosis of failure to progress, it's often that the medical system is jumping in and trying to make labour happen quicker. So I'm going to throw that back to Marina and go, this is one of the reasons that this research is so important.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. Incredibly important. I think with failure to progress, maybe my preference would be to use the term labor dystocia in that context, just because failure is just a horrible term to throw at women. So in Australia, the last data that we have around failure to progress is that around 30% of the women who start their labor naturally, they will have something called augmentation during labor. So their labor will be declared as too slow, and it will be subjected to interventions to make this labor faster again, whether that's by opening up the membranes around the baby, so an artificial rupture of membranes, or by using medications such as oxytocin. So that's 1/3 of women who are subjected to that. And when we look at women who are having their first baby, that's 40% of women who are subjected to labor augmentation because we say their labor is too slow. However, it's really interesting to look at the definition of too slow labor, which is like labor dystocia. It's not internationally well defined at all. So basically what we did as researchers, and by we I don't mean us specifically, but researchers in general, we looked at hundreds and thousands and 500,000 of women in various countries, and we measured the duration of the different phases of labor. And then we arrived at an average duration. So we have this average duration of, say, maybe 12 to 18 hours for first stage. And then because we define this average, we then go on and falsely claim this average is normal. Like average and normal is two very different things, but we somehow arrived at this point where we say you are only having a normal labor progression if it falls into this average curve. And this is the problem that women are facing when they are cared for by various medical professionals, that we kind of always measure their duration of labor and their so-called progress of labor against these statistics of what is average. They can be slower, it can be faster, it can still be normal, and it can be diverse and all over the place. But our current data and research often doesn't accommodate that appropriately.
Just on that, I'm just going to chop in as well and say, and that's also, and this is too big for this conversation today, but also stages of labour aren't a thing either. So I just really want to make sure that we do, even though we will talk about stages of labour because that's the accepted norm, there is no stage in labour.
Yeah.
Labour is a continuum, and the research that those hours, like Marina just talked about, it's nonsense. Like there is no real research to say how long labour should last and how, what stage is a stage, because that just doesn't exist.
And for people playing at home, if you plan on having your baby in hospital, what will often happen is every 4 hours or so, depending on where you are, you'll be offered a vaginal exam to check how far dilated your cervix is. And if your cervix isn't opening at the agreed pattern that the hospital agrees it should be opening at, and you end up, say, 6 centimeters for 5 or 6 hours, and then there's slow opening of your cervix, they might tell you that your body is failing to progress and failing in labor to get towards the stage of pushing out your baby. And as Marina was saying, if women don't comply with this time frame that the hospital wants them to comply with, they'll apply things like breaking your waters and syntocinon augmentation in order to speed up your labor, to bring it back within the curve that Marina was talking about, the normal, I'm using inverted commas, normal curve. This is partly because birth is seen as a medical event. And if you've got a medical event, then it could potentially become pathological. So all these little checks and measures have been put in place to be able to decide which births are becoming pathological and which births are still normal. The unfortunate thing is we don't really understand physiology very well to start with, to be able to decide what's normal and what's not normal. And so we're kind of stuck with this terminology of failure to progress. And in your 2023 paper, which is the failure to progress or just normal, you refer to what's called as the straight line obstetrics theory. And I feel like I know what that means based on that wording, but only because that's been part of my thinking already. But can you explain what you mean by straight line obstetrics theory?
Yeah, that's a term that was coined by two other researchers, Betty Ann Davis and Ken Johnson in Canada. And they used this term to describe this expectation that we think once, or generally, it is thought that once labor starts, it should progress continuously. So once a woman goes into labor and she starts having surges of labor, then we kind of expect that those surges always get closer and closer and closer together, and also more intense, more intense, more intense as we go along. And there is no acknowledgement of any occurrence of a slowdown or lull or plateau during that time. So the straight line expectation is kind of, we expect it starts and then it continues in a straight line. And then we have these arbitrary rules of thumb that we use in clinical practice. Sometimes it's a 1 centimeter per hour rule of cervical dilation. So we expect that the opening of the womb, the cervix opens 1 centimeter per hour. This is hugely outdated, around 70 years old, often challenge this rule. Some clinicians still use it. Then we have a more recent rule that's around 0.5 centimeter per hour. Basically, all the rules that we have, even the most recent recommendations by the World Health Organization, which says that we have to expect various centimeters per hour depending on where the woman is in labor, even those ones still expect that there's a continuous progress. So that's straight line. We expect this continuous progress, no allowance for any pauses.
Right. So if you look at it on a graph, it just goes up linearly without dips or ebbs or flows. And you know, you talk about in one of your papers, gosh, I can't remember which one it was now, I've highlighted so much, but all the different sort of patterns that labor can take. And so you're proposing different terminology for these pauses and stops in labor. And you're proposing that we call these slow points physiological plateaus. So can you describe what you mean by a physiological plateau?
So maybe first around how we arrived at this term. So a lot of people use a lot of different terms around that, like lull, pause, natural pause, phase 2.51. Like people get hugely creative because it doesn't really, those pauses aren't really acknowledged to exist, sort of like you wouldn't find them in the midwifery obstetrics textbook. So everyone who talks about them, who researches them, has to make up their own terms. We arrived at physiological plateaus, which other researchers have used before us, because it kind of emphasizes that it's normal, like physiological means healthy, normal, and plateau that it just slows down. So it can be the surges slowing down for a while, it can be the surges disappearing entirely for a while, but it can also be the cervix, like the neck of the womb, not opening up as quickly as we want, or even closing down again during labor, which is also not really acknowledged to exist, like the cervical reversal. So this physiological plateau really just means something slows down during labor and it's normal.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So physiological, as you said, means that it's a normal bodily event. And so it's just, so what you're saying is labor is actually normally not linear. It doesn't progress in a single line. If you looked at the line on a graph, it goes up, down, straight, across, whatever it wants to do.
Yeah.
I love that you said that, because I'm a home birth midwife as well. And 15 years ago, when I was with my mentor, and really I hadn't had much experience in the hospital yet, so I didn't have a lot of unlearning to do. She used to call it the rest and be thankful phase.
Yeah.
And I feel like everybody in the space is resting and being thankful at that point. The woman, the partner, the support person, the midwife is all just thankful for this lull. Claire, I wanted to ask you, and Marina, you might have some experience in this as well. When the woman is in a lull, in a plateau in labour, what should be the behaviour of her care providers around that?
Well, and this is, I mean, it's interesting. There'll be two things on this. I'll talk to my experience as a midwife, and then I'm going to ask Marina as well to talk about what the research told us. Because in my experience as a midwife, it's often we do nothing. We just hold, it's again those terminologies. So as a midwife, yes, same as you, I saw the rest and be thankful phases often when I first started as a home birth midwife. We don't see them in hospital because if we have a rest, then we're usually trying to find out what's going on. And the one that we really talk about, the rest and be thankful phase, is the one that's often seen just before the woman starts to push her baby out. So it literally, the room just becomes quiet. The woman's been having regular, strong surges, and then they just stop. And the woman often will pop her head down. You know exactly what I'm talking about, Molly, if you've seen it. She usually pops her head down on the side of the pool and then just looks like she's fallen asleep. And everyone just gets that little bubble of excitement because you just know that the baby's not far away. And then often she just looks up, she everything changes, and then she pushes her baby. So that was quite common knowledge, the rest and be thankful phase. So often you did nothing in that phase. And I think that's the difference of when you see them all the time, you just trust there's a reason for them. And sometimes you do nothing, and sometimes you might need to do something. And I think that's the point that if it's okay with you, Mel, I'm going to throw that back to Marina, because that's really interesting when we look at the research around physiological plateaus. Because one of the great things about Marina's PhD was that she did these fantastic pictures. And if anybody's ever seen Marina present, she has these fabulous pictures that she drew, which I just loved as a supervisor, because she had a picture of the midwife sitting with all these little thoughts that went around her head. And the picture was of the woman in a pool of water, I think it was, wasn't it, Marina? And then you had like these little thought bubbles for the midwife, who was doing nothing, but she was thinking, is it this, is it that, is it the other? And she has the thought processes. So often, even though we do nothing, we're not necessarily doing nothing, if that makes sense.
Yes. And Marina, were those your pictures in your paper as well? I was so tempted to screenshot them and
Yes, yeah, there are the pictures, but I'm not the one who takes credit for them. There was an artist who did them. Like, I commissioned them from a professional artist. She does beautiful paintings. But yeah, completely agree with what Claire says. It's highly dependent on the situation. So when midwives just sit with a woman in labor, we often look like we're not doing anything, but there's a huge amount of stuff happening in our head. So we're analyzing the situation. We're not just looking at the woman, we're listening, we're feeling kind of like the hormones in the room. We know what is happening around the woman with the family members. What is her story? Like, what does she want during labor? What was really important to her? Where is she in life? So we have all these things, and they're coming together. And this helps us as midwives, even if we don't look like we're doing something, to make a really thorough assessment of why this labor pattern that we see is happening. So, for example, when it slows down, we might start thinking into the direction, why is it slowing down? That might be for the mother, anything psychological comes up for her. Maybe she's really anxious or worried. Maybe she's fearful of the next phase of labor, which can be really intense. Maybe she's feeling not quite ready to receive her baby yet because it's a massive change. It can be things having to do with the baby as well. Maybe the baby is not in ideal position. So sometimes the surgeons just slow down to give baby more time to arrive in a position that's more favorable for birth. Can be really physical things of the body, like if the woman didn't sleep for the past 3 days and 3 nights, she would be really exhausted. So maybe the body is just asking for that pause to regain energy, or maybe a toast, or some drink to regain that sugar in the blood. So it can be really a lot of different things, and that's what we're kind of assessing as midwives when we're with a woman who has a plateau during labor. And to answer your question of what we then do, well, it's highly dependent on the situation. If a woman is really tired and we think this is the reason, well, we just let her sleep. If if we feel that she's hungry, we'll offer toast and things like that. Sometimes we offer things as midwives. For example, we might suggest an intimate environment. We might send a woman to another room where she can be quiet without any people who are observing her during labor, because for some people, depending on their personality, it can make a massive change if you're feeling observed in labor or not, and that can slow your labor down. So it really depends on what is happening in this situation with this woman, with her personal history, of what we then do. But what we don't do, we don't throw medication on every single woman who has a pause during labor.
This is what's so important, because often when we talk about those physiological plateaus, which we see all the time in the home environment, okay, this is normal for most midwives that work with physiological birth, but the not jumping in and treating it medically is a huge thing, because we're trusting. And I think that's the thing that I really want to get across. We're trusting the body knows what it's doing and the baby knows what it's doing. So the woman and the baby work together to get the best outcome for the woman and the baby. But we're not dangerous. And I think this is the big thing. And this came up heaps in Marina's PhD with our panel, which was quite interesting, because I was the midwife and the primary supervisor, and we had 2 nurses that were co-supervisors with us. And of course, those were the questions we got asked early on and throughout the PhD. And it's so interesting, because we often go straight to, but how long's too long, and what if something happens, and why aren't we doing anything? So again, it's really important to go that we are doing stuff. It's not that we're just doing nothing. but it doesn't necessarily mean that we're intervening in a way that is augmenting. So often it's not that we're not ignoring it, I suppose is what I'm trying to say. We're acknowledging that there's a physiological plateau and usually trusting that it is something physiological rather than pathological until proven otherwise. So I think that's the big thing to think about as well. It's just not the fact that we're going, okay, everything is always normal. It's the fact that you're going through that checklist in your head and you're checking in with the woman and you're going, okay, what is actually going on here? And it's individualized.
And I think that when you have spent so long watching physiological birth, the physiological plateaus actually become incredibly obvious compared to pathological plateaus or labour dystocia. Whereas I find with physiological plateaus, women are quite calm usually. Sometimes they have a tumultuous kind of transitional period, but I mean, I think it would be different, and it comes from intimately knowing normal birth and intimately knowing the woman. But because clinicians in hospital haven't been allowed to value this part of birth and labour, it's hard for them to know truly if they're in a pathological situation or not, and especially because they don't have the support of the hospital to allow, I mean, again, inverted commas, allow women to have a physiological rest in their labour. And I think, Claire, you alluded to it, that, you know, a general rule, I think, is to not wake a woman up. If she's in a physiological plateau, this rest is just as important as the contraction. And so to wake a woman up from sleep in labour, it is interrupting physiology. And you make mention, Marina, in your paper that I'm reading an actual quote here, that physiological plateaus may be an essential mechanism of self-regulation of the mother and infant dyad, facilitating feto-maternal adaptation and preventing maternal and fetal distress during labour. You and I understand what that sentence means because we're in this world and we understand that kind of terminology. But what are you trying to communicate here with this particular, it was a conclusion on one of your papers from the abstract. Yeah, what does that mean?
Yes, it basically comes back to the philosophy and importance of philosophy that you just mentioned. Like, we think about philosophy being something fluffy that doesn't really have to do anything with real life, but it does. So like you say, if we see normal and we see it and we see it and we see it again and again, we get this understanding of what is physiological. But if we don't see it, and this is the situation we currently have in maternity care, when we educate obstetricians and midwives, we send them to hospitals with high intervention rates. So their chance of seeing physiological labor is really slim. And you would be surprised of how few midwifery graduates come out and new obstetricians come out of their training, and they have seen very, very few physiological births. So then you kind of approach birth with that fear inside of you, and you're thinking something's probably going wrong. So you're lacking this trust. And if you're lacking this trust, your first reaction to whatever you see during labor would probably be, it's probably not normal. Women probably can't birth. This process is probably not working good. I better do something to help this woman have a baby because she's not really, built or capable to do it. So from that belief set, we currently operate in large parts of our maternity care system, not everywhere, of course. And then we interpret those pauses as something abnormal. And then what you just said from the conclusion of our paper is seeking to challenge this kind of misconception of plateaus. So when we speak with midwives who have worked in home birth settings, for example, they have seen hundreds and hundreds of physiological births with all the beautiful diversity that comes with it. And these midwives tell us that these pauses are normal. This is an incredibly powerful knowledge that we need to share, because those pauses, those plateaus, they don't just happen sort of randomly because the body doesn't know what to do or because it's like an error in nature. They happen probably for a very good reason that we might not fully understand right now. We might not fully understand in 10 years or ever. But there's probably a good reason why that happens. For example, if the baby is in an unfortunate position and then the surges go away, that means that the uterus, like the womb around the baby, is relaxing. So when it's relaxing, that gives baby more ability to actually move around again and find a better position. But also if the mother is very, very tired, there's something happening in her body on all levels, like whether that's hormonal or biochemical. It has to do with the sugar that she has available, the energy that she has available in her body. So if her body then sort of, in inverted commas, decides to have a plateau, it's probably for a very good reason. And it keeps mother and baby probably safe. Now, there is no type of research on this planet that you can do to say exactly what is happening during that pause biochemically in the baby and in the mom. So we kind of have to trust those midwives and their observations, which are really valuable. So basically what we're saying, these pauses, they aren't random. There is probably a very, very, very good reason why nature is doing these pauses. And if we don't know any better, and right now we don't, we should probably not interfere with them.
I agree.
And I think on the flip side of that, we can see what happens when we do interfere with them. So classic example, like you just said, Marina, like one of the things as a clinician, so I'm talking as a clinician rather than a researcher, is that we see that baby that's in, that first time mama that's been labouring really, really well. And you just start to see those contractions and those surges go a little bit, big one, small one, incoordinate, she starts to look more less laboury, she's a little bit more back in the room, and then everything's kind of slows down. And that, as a clinician, you go, oh, that baby's, so, the head's deflex, it's in an occipital posterior position, or it's just got its hand up there, it's just doing something a bit funky. And then often, we might do stuff. This is one of those things when sometimes you might be getting the woman, or helping the woman if she's not doing it herself to change position or do funky stuff, using the rebosos or whatever, or letting her sleep, whatever it is. But on the flip side, this is in the home environment. When you see that happen in hospital, and I've seen this time and time again, they go, oh, those contractions are slowing down. They're incoordinate. Let's give you some augmentation. Let's pop some Syntocin on to get that contraction pattern back. So that arbitrary contraction pattern that we talk about, the 3 contractions in 10 that last X amount of time, because that's what the textbooks tell us that we need to get a baby out. And then classically, we see that baby pushed down into the pelvis in that awkward position. And then the woman needs a cesarean. So I think we've got the flip side, that if we don't start recognizing that these physiological plateaus have a really good reason, like Marina said, there's usually a really good reason that mum and baby are working together to get an optimal outcome. And the optimal outcome is usually a physiological birth. But when we intervene, often we make more problems. This is why this research is so important.
Mm-hmm. And I love that you're gathering stories from home birth midwives and midwives who have seen physiological birth, because we can know if a plateau is physiological if in the end the woman and the baby are well and remained well during their labour, and then the baby was born and they both still remained well. You could safely make the conclusion that whatever happened in that lull or in that labour and that plateau was normal because everybody's well. And then you've just learnt a new boundary of what's normal in labour. I myself had what I would call a physiological plateau, but it lasted about 8 hours and I was fully dilated. But I was in labour with my baby was 36 weeks gestation, and I'd been labouring for nearly 32 hours by the time the plateau happened. And so you kind of go, well, yeah, I mean, that baby's little. She's been in labor for a while. My husband fell asleep and I ended up falling asleep down between the wall and the bed on a pile of pillows, and no one could find me for about 3 hours because they didn't want to come into the room because my husband was asleep, and they said, we didn't know where you were. We couldn't find you. And I was like, what happened? And they said, you were missing for about 3 hours. But I think also what midwives need to realize too is that if there's no contractions, there's usually not really a danger either, because contractions are a physiological stress on a baby. They're designed to cope with that though. And so if a baby is feeling a little bit stressed with contractions and then the contractions stop, you can most of the time feel reassured that that baby's also having a rest along with its mum. And so we're not in a high-risk pathological situation because where there's no contractions.
Yeah, that's a really good point raising there. And I love completeness and how it still defeats us. Like, if the woman is in labor, her labor already started, but the contractions go away. And the contractions are what's causing stress on her body and on the baby's body, because when the womb contracts, the oxygen flow to the baby is impacted by that. So there's, for a very short period of time, there's a little bit less oxygen going to the baby, and the baby's coping really well with that. But it's obviously causing stress on the baby, especially if the surges are very common. So now suddenly the surges are gone during labor, and we all freak out. Like, we panic. But this woman who's in labor and is having a pause, she's basically no different from any other woman who is in late pregnancy. Like, we wouldn't panic when we see a woman in the third trimester. Doesn't make sense. You're right.
Okay, so far we've learned that in hospital, physiological lulls are unappreciated, they're considered pathological, and then they usually get tried to get fixed, again, inverted commas, with medicine because it doesn't comply with what's considered normal labour. And what you're proposing is that physiological lulls are just that, physiological and normal, and labour is not linear. You know, you alluded in one of your papers that this concept of physiological plateaus is not necessarily new, but through history has been suppressed somewhere along the line.
Yep.
Can you talk to us about that suppression?
Well, women's knowledge is generally hasn't really been appreciated. And I think it goes back to thinking about birth was women's business. So for the entire history of birth, women have given birth with other women. So it wasn't knowledge that was passed to men. And I know I'm talking about men and women. And of course, nowadays we have female obstetricians and we have male midwives. But historically, when we look at birth, it was in the home, attended by women and midwives. So the knowledge around birth was very much in the home. And it wasn't really something that was shared with outsiders. Realistically, it's only the last couple of 100 years that any medicine really has got involved in birth. So when we look at the knowledge that was passed on, it was oral, it wasn't written down, and women weren't very appreciated in their knowledge. Their knowledge wasn't really accepted as true science. So then we transfer birth into the hospital. There is no knowledge about labour and birth. We look at that mind and body separate. We look at the woman's body is a machine, and then of course it's a machine and it's also a faulty machine, and therefore we need medicine to fix it. So I think what I'm trying to allude to is when we look at this knowledge, it's lost because it wasn't valued. So it's not new knowledge, it's always been around. The way that we look at birth, particularly in the maternity system now, is the new knowledge. And it's not based really on science. It's just what we've decided. So keep going back to, Friedman's curve, all that studies. It's not really very good science, but it's all we've got. And we thought, that'll work. We want it to be linear. We want it to be really easy to predict, because that makes, in theory, it easier, because the maternity system is designed as an industry, and it's designed to get women in, have the babies out, and get the babies and mums alive and well at the end of it. So we want to be able to be really, really proactive and productive. Whereas we know that birth isn't like that. It's a little bit trickier to get them to fit into the system. So that, very, very brief answer to something that is massive is in the knowledge has always been there. Women and midwives have always had the knowledge, and the other people that surround birth, but it hasn't transferred into the hospital system because it isn't valued, isn't talked about, and it's also being lost because we've medicalized birth. So there's only very few people around that really have this knowledge anyway. And then usually they're on the fringes because they are the home birthing women and the home birthing midwives. And particularly in Australia, it is not understood. It is fringe, and it is rebellious midwives, Mel, to talk about the way you do, this podcast, rather than being very skilled clinicians and very capable women.
And the concept of labour being linear and complying to a time frame is the backbone of medical management of childbirth. So this idea of physiological plateaus actually challenges the very structure of how birth is approached in a hospital. So it's no surprise that, we're still trying to convince people that we need to bring the cesarean section rate down. Like, there's so much acceptance of intervention that to propose an idea like this, I imagine we've got an uphill battle.
Yeah, it was counterculture. And the other thing is, again, we talk about that reducing the cesarean section, right? If we increase, which again, it's not rocket science, rather than reducing the cesarean section, we need to increase birth physiology. So if we increase normal birth, therefore, just because it works, the cesarean section will reduce, won't it? For example, breech, we don't need to go into lots of stuff, but, most women now have breech presentation, they have a cesarean. Whereas if we increase knowledge around physiology in breech births, then you would increase normal birth in breech presentation, apart from very few of them. And yes, that's why we have medicine. It's amazing, and thank goodness we do, because sometimes we need some help out there. But it's flipping that way of looking at it, going, we expect it to be normal until proven otherwise, as opposed to we expect it to be pathological, and then, well, you had your baby against the odds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I would like to add something as well, like we're talking about intervention and intervention cascades a little bit, and how it's important to reduce or cesareans or bring up physiological birth. It's really important. I just want to stress why it's important. It's not some sort of ideology. It's not some sort of ideology of people who think there shouldn't be interventions. Women should just do it physiologically or without any help or something. It's not like that. It's because those interventions have really detrimental effects for mom and baby. If you want to improve the outcomes for both of them, we need to reduce interventions. For example, when we have slow labor and then the woman faces labor augmentation, for example, with oxytocin or oxytocin drip, then we have a higher risk for the contractions to get too often, like too frequent. We call it uterine hyperstimulation. And then we have a baby that is getting highly distressed. Then we have to react. We can't leave a highly distressed baby in a womb when it's in stress. So then we go out down this kind of staircase or cascade of interventions, and then we try to get the baby out as quickly as possible. And that all comes with risks for mom and baby, whether that's impairing the bonding or the healing. When we do a forceps birth, we usually have severe perineal injury, so we have big tears for the woman, or even episiotomy, so the cuts to the perineum. We have all these things that come because we intervened in the first place. And this is important to understand. We're not propagating intervention for the sake of no intervention. We're propagating less interventions and only interventions for those women who really need it and benefit from it. Yes, when necessary, instead of just routinely for every woman for arbitrary reasons.
And it's on that as well, Marina, like you were saying, the cascades of intervention and the high intervention rate and the detrimental effects on mum and baby, that is absolutely scientifically recorded. There's lots of research to demonstrate that too much intervention is detrimental to mums and babies. And it's not just at birth. It's not just looking at the high incidence of the outcomes there you were talking about, instrumental birth, cesarean birth, perineal trauma, babies in nurseries, so separated from mum, reduced breastfeeding, and actual ongoing increased antibiotic use. There's so many things attached to those interventions. And absolutely, when they are needed, they are, absolutely valid. But when you're using those kind of interventions and having those outcomes on so many babies and mums, it is extremely worrying.
And we know that, like you said, we know there's evidence to show that interventions can increase the risk for women and babies. I'm just struggling to think of a risk to leaving a woman sleep if she's having a rest. I mean, we're not
giving her a cup of tea or a sandwich. I guess she's a bit hungry.
Yeah. I mean, what's the risk in letting someone have a rest?
It's not very economic. If you're running a business and the business is trying to get the people quickly through, it's not very economic to have those pauses where a midwife, fully paid, is being with a woman who's sleeping. So from an economic perspective, it's not a good thing to have somebody have repeated or even one lull during labor.
Yeah, I have to say, if it weren't for my midwives who took it in shifts to be with me, if it weren't for them saying, you're okay, we always check at home. The benchmark is the woman okay? Is the baby okay? Is everybody well? And if they are, you're like, well, we are still in a physiological situation, whatever is going on. If the woman is well and the baby is well, we're still in a physiological situation. And I'm so grateful that they slept on my couch and had all their meals at my house for a few days and did all these things to nurture and just support my journey of, waiting for labor to start again.
But that's the problem, isn't it? Because our maternity system is not set up to do that. So yes, if you have your own midwife who has got colleagues that can support her, and you can rest during your client's labour and have that, but the maternity system, in theory, I mean, really it is, because it's 24/7. So there should always be somebody there. But economically, like Marina said, it is not set up to have women just sleeping or having a snack rather than having a baby. So that is a big problem. The maternity system is not designed to have physiological birth in it.
Yeah. And I think...
And there's sort of... Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I just wanted to say there's something else connected to that as well, because once we have the outcomes or the impact on the women and the babies, like if we rush through labor, but we also, and this is also important, we also have an impact on the midwives. Midwives don't want to do that. We don't want to rush women through labor, but if we work in tertiary hospitals that have these policies and guidelines in place that are based on very, very outdated evidence, then we are forced to enforce those policies, so to speak. So if we then have a woman who's pausing and who's not fitting into the straight lines that our policy expects us, then we have to suggest to her to do something. We have to offer her interventions. And we hate doing that. Even those midwives who are working in hospitals, we adapt to it because we have to adapt to it. But there's so many midwives who are leaving the profession. They're either going part-time because they can't take it anymore. They're leaving midwifery entirely. They are going to the home birthing space. Not every midwife can do that because it means being on call 24/7 as well. So it has an impact on our profession as well, and we are losing people. We're losing people into burnout. We're having people who are having moral injury because repeatedly they have to force things through they don't want to do. We don't want to do that as midwives. So acknowledging those pauses during labor, like really simple thing, just acknowledging that they exist and sort of allowing people to write that down in the documentation and to let that be an official thing that can be recognized even in tertiary hospitals, that would help women, it would help midwives, it would help babies, it would help everyone.
And I think that's another thing to just, and what Marina's alluding to, is that a lot of midwives know these are normal, but because, again, it's that knowledge that isn't accepted. So I know, Mel, you've talked before on the podcast about authoritative knowledge. So when we're talking about authoritative knowledge, that's usually the knowledge that decisions are made on as well, and what's accepted. So going back to what I was talking about before, about in the home environment or pre-medicalisation of birth, that knowledge that the midwives and women had was authoritative knowledge. So we would go, the woman say, I'm fine, back off, have a snooze or have a cup of tea, I'm going to get there, and vice versa. But now that's not the accepted knowledge within the hospital environment and the medicalised system. Whereas if like Marina was saying, if midwives acknowledged it and said, this woman is tired, she has been up, it's her first baby, now she's in hospital, but she hasn't slept for 2 nights before because she's been surging on and off, I reckon let her have a sleep and then we'll see what we're like in a couple of hours. And actually stood up for their knowledge as well and what they understand, then if people were talking about it more, then maybe it would become more accepted knowledge again.
Yeah. Well, and that's a call to midwives, I think. There's nothing from stopping midwives adopting this into their language, and that when a woman is having a lull or a plateau in her labour, you could say to the woman, in normal labour, your body gives you this rest, and maybe we can just welcome that rest. How would you feel about that? And you could also say to them, look, this hospital doesn't acknowledge rest as a normal part of labour. I acknowledge the rest as a normal part of labour. What would you like to do? There's a few options. You could either just rest, and I'm comfortable with that, or the hospital would have me offer you an IV drip with fluids or an IV drip with artificial oxytocin, or, whatever it is that your policy will recommend. And so there's nothing stopping midwives from informing women of the physiological process of labour when they're in labour, and also making sure you've got to satisfy the requirements of your hospital by letting the woman know that, there is also a policy which actually dictates that I should be doing this, but you have a choice in this scenario. Yeah, I guess that's a call to midwives. Like, let's just adopt it into the language. It's okay to take it back, to take physiological birth back, Everyone's just nodding like, yes, Mel, keep
Yes,
talking.
yeah. Well, it is. It's
Yeah,
and
no,
that's exactly why Marina's
absolutely.
come up with that terminology. It's a physiological plateau, so call it what it is. It took her a
Yeah.
long time to get that.
I just want to jump in
Terminology.
there. You said nothing is stopping midwives. Sorry, I have to stop you there because,
Yeah.
yes, I agree. Nothing is stopping midwives from acknowledging that language and using that language and telling women about it. But there are things stopping us currently in big tertiary hospitals from actually acknowledging that and letting women. So what we often hear from midwives who are working in these confined spaces, so to speak, or hostile spaces for physiological birth, is they are really trying hard to protect women from unnecessary intervention. So we have women and there's somebody outside of the room, whether that's an obstetrician or a midwife who is like the supervisor or whoever. It can be, various professions, and they are pressuring for that woman to have regular vaginal examinations, to be kind of on this straight line, to have interventions that speed up labor because it's more economical and things like that. So if we have somebody outside the room who's constantly putting pressure on us, and we know this pressure is there to produce a baby quickly, and sometimes we try to shield the woman from this pressure, because if she feels time pressure during labor, we know that's going to mess up the entire process. It's going to mess up all the hormones that she needs to be in this calm and beautiful and trance-like state to labor peacefully. So we're trying to shield the woman from that. And often, or sometimes, what midwives do is they kind of fudge things a little. So we control the information that's leaving the room. We might say to our supervisor or the obstetrician, well, she's actually progressing really well. It's going fast. Or she's like 8 centimeters dilated, while in reality, the woman is sleeping. Or while in reality, she's maybe 10 centimeters dilated, but we don't want the clock to start on this so-called full dilation, because then she's only allowed to have 2 more hours to birth the baby. So sometimes we say, well, she's actually in the middle of labor, things like that. So there's a lot of kind of fudging going on in some hospitals, where midwives really try to protect women, because if we don't, then we know people will come in and will try to pressure not us as midwives, but the woman. And that sometimes takes the form of coercion. So somebody's coming in and telling the woman, oh, this is dangerous, but you have to do this. If we don't do it, it's going to have horrible effect, things like that. And that's reality. Women hear these stories and they report them as obstetric violence and as coercion. And we try to protect women from that. So, yeah, midwives should, nothing is stopping midwives, but some things are stopping midwives.
And on that, I'm going to add to that, because I feel quite strongly about this. And I do understand the pressures that midwives in the system have. However, and Marina is talking then, and that came up in her PhD, that midwives are protecting women. That's what they do, 100%. They're trying to keep people outside the room or women at home. They're trying to do what they can because they understand physiology and they want to support it. But it's about acknowledging your knowledge and your skill. And if you stand up, and I'm not saying every midwife can do this, because, you have to keep yourself safe as a midwife. But wouldn't it be fantastic if that midwife stood at the door and didn't go, oh, she's 8 or 10 or whatever, she's made up to try and keep those people out the room? What about if she went outside the room and said, I am a skilled clinician. This is my assessment. This woman is having a physiological plateau, which, is very clearly documented within the notes. She's fine. The baby's fine. I'm closely monitoring it, and I will keep you informed. Because by owning her skill, by owning that knowledge, that's the only way we can get change. And then maybe the next midwife that's on shift or in the other room hears that and goes, oh my gosh, she's standing up for the knowledge that I'm doing. And then if more of us actually owned that and said, I'm great here, thank you for caring, but this is what's happening, and use those terminology, use the reality of the case, because otherwise all that happens is we do all this wonderful research, we find out there's a thing called physiological plateaus, we see it in the home environment, we see it in the hospital, and we hide it. Whereas if we acknowledge it and showed everyone, and then, like Mel said earlier, we've got then the event that, oh, that woman had a sleep, then she got up and pushed a baby out and everyone was well, then maybe practice would change.
And you can, when you're doing handover and you're handing over to the next midwife, saying, so this is such and such, whatever's happened, we had a 3-hour physiological lull, but contractions have started again. And, just dropping it into conversation before I think you can change hospital culture. And the other people that I think it helps is doctors who are transitioning through the hospital, because doctors often move on from one hospital to the next hospital to the next hospital. And if all of a sudden they start to hear this language of physiological plateau at one hospital, and then they move to another workplace, and all of a sudden, they think, oh, hang on, I learned a little bit about physiological plateaus at this hospital, but at this hospital they're not mentioning it. It slowly seeps out. And I do think that through just dropping the words, it piques curiosity. I know you guys were making a suggestion that you were looking for the right words for this, and that physiological plateau felt like an all-encompassing way of describing it. I was coming up with my own little ways. I was like, "Ooh, how could we make it really zingy?" I don't know, labor lull. So if you were communicating that to somebody, oh, she's just having a lull in labor. It's just a lull. It sounds really, benign when you're having a lull.
Yeah, love it. It sounds and really simpler as well, right? We sometimes say natural pause, but it's all big and clunky. I like lull.
Labor lull. It's just a lull. It feels calming too, just a lull. Beautiful. Look, I don't have any further questions for you guys, but is there anything in your research that we haven't yet tapped into that you wanted to make us aware of?
Well, I'm going to throw Marina and get her to talk about our current studies, because I think that would be really useful. And that's kind of how we ended up on the podcast, because obviously, Mel, I saw that you'd popped something on the socials, and then I commented because there was women commenting on it. So I'll lead.
I'm going to link back to what Melanie said as well. You said it's important to get the message out to get more people talking about this naturally. And this is what we're doing. So we're doing two things. We do research, but we also do a lot of dissemination work. So I'm going to talk about dissemination briefly. So we don't just do the research publications, which I know no one is reading except for, researchers and geeks and things.
Everyone's going to read it. They're all going to be emailing us going, please.
Well, on this podcast, whoever's on the mailing list gets access to my resource list, which any freely available full text articles get put on there. And one of yours is open access and the other one isn't. But if you want to make the other one publicly available, I'm willing to share it with that. There's
absolutely.
Great. Okay, if you're on the mailing list, you'll get.
And we also have other resources. So, for example, we also created little explainer videos, just a 2-minute video that summarizes what is a natural or what is a physiological plateau. And we have that in English. We have it coming up. We have it already published in French. We will have it in Spanish, Indonesian, German, Polish, Russian, and so forth. So we're really trying to get the message out wide and broad. And we'll have a website as well that is summarizing all the information about physiological plateaus. So that will be coming up, and I'm just going to drop the links to you so you can share them through your networks. But then what is also important is the research that Claire just alluded to. So what we did so far is we spoke to midwives and collected their thoughts on physiological plateaus. And now we're doing the kind of sister study to that, which is really important. We are actually asking women about their experiences, which is so important because women's stories are the stories that should shape maternity care. They should decide how we call it, what we do around it, what it is, how we define it. So we're currently running a big survey across Australia where women can share their birth stories and specifically their experiences of pauses during labor, like when it paused, what happened, what was the situation around it, how did they feel about it, what was offered to them, whether they were kind of advised to wait or to do something or to have interventions. And we're collecting all this information again to inform policy change, because how it works in practice is you have these policies that we have to adhere to as health professionals, but these policies are based on research. So unless we have the research to change the policies, we can't really change them. So this is one thing we are actually doing at the moment. It's called the We Pause study, and I'll send you a link as well to please share through your network. It would be amazing if there's one woman or another who wants to answer this survey. And another study that we're doing is a bigger one, is the Pause Matters study. This is a study where we generate quantitative data, so statistics, numbers, hard facts on how often do these pauses happen, how long are they, which phases during labor do they happen. Usually everyone is trusting the big numbers, so if you throw out numbers like it happens so often and these women have beautiful birth outcomes and the babies have these and those UPGAR scores and whatnot, and you really put it into nice funky numbers, then this can also try and help convince people. So we are running those two studies, the We Pause study for women and the Pause Matters study where we are counting plateaus, so to speak.
We will definitely, in the show notes below this podcast, put all of those links. So if you want to participate in that study, all you need to do is scroll down, just like one little finger scroll under this podcast, and then just click the link, and they can get access and participate in that research. I'll certainly do it because I'm one of those women. Amazing.
Thank you.
Okay.
And it's a very short survey as well. It won't take a lot of your time.
Beautiful. Easy. Well, we're going to put that in the show notes below. And we've been talking about physiological plateaus or labour lulls. We'll see what catches on. I think this is some of the more rebellious research that I've come across because it's reframing what medicine has told us birth is, and this is what midwives have been trying to do ever since ever since medicine has taken birth out of the realm of physiological womanhood. And we're just trying to steal it back. And this is the kind of stuff that does it. So I just want to applaud you guys for this work. And I want to encourage midwives and doulas and women who are listening and doctors who are listening. There are doctors who listen to this podcast. Just start dropping the terms physiological plateau into your handovers, onto the whiteboard. You know, there's a little whiteboard there. Just PP, physiological plateau.
Yep, sounds good.
That's where we're at. Do not enter. Amazing, guys. Thank you so much for your time. If you're part of the mailing list, you will get access to these research papers. And if you'd like to participate in this research, scroll down under the show notes, but I'll also send it out with the mailing list.
Thanks, Mel. Thanks so much.
Thanks, guys. Awesome.
Thank you so much, Melanie.
Thank you for being here for today's episode of the Great Birth Rebellion podcast. If you want to get access to all the resources that we use to create every single podcast episode, you can join the mailing list at melaniethemidwife.com, or better still, the Premium Members Hub. The Premium members get access to transcripts, the Ask Mel a Question button, an exclusive Ask Me Anything episode every month. All the details are in the show notes, and I will see you in the next episode of the Great Birth Rebellion.